Hello, everybody. This is True Demon, the Devil Stockbroker. I have just gotten up after a night of almost no sleep because I feel incapable of containing my absolute seething rage at the message that was received last night on my Twitter feed from this individual, Mr. Peter Schiff, and the level of ignorance that I read in these three sentences is beyond my comprehension. This man who has been made the success that he is by this stock market and the global economy and his position in society has enabled him to accumulate great sums of wealth. And there is no doubting that he is extremely good with money. But what I read here in this message is the sentiment of a person who has such a level of apathy and ambivalence to the struggle of individual people. In fact, more than 300 million people. And that's just in the United States. And I find myself completely unable to contain my rage any further. Mr. Peter Schiff, whose career was created in the 1980s and 1990s, starting at Lehman Brothers, a bank which some of you might recognize as failing during the housing crisis of 2008 as a direct result of their irresponsible collection of malignant financial devices that were tied inextricably to the housing market and therefore crashed along with it. This man who called the housing crash of 2008 2 full years early because he knew that the entire housing market was propped up by bad loans, which were signed off on by a corrupted ratings agency who had been strong-armed by Wall Street investment banks into accepting AAA ratings for loans that they knew had a 20% rating of likelihood to default. Peter Schiff had a unique perspective, being a person who was in the stock market and being tied to all of these different firms and recognizing the warning signs earlier than anyone else did. So he knew that the crash was coming, and he had the extremely unique perspective of a person who knew who was to blame for it and why. So to read this from a person who had all of that context, that deep an understanding of the financial markets, and to see that their answer is to punish everybody else who's saddled with all of the irresponsibility of Wall Street 2 times previous between the crash of 2008 and the 2014 recession. I quote, "To successfully fight inflation, the government must eliminate the $3 trillion annual budget deficit." I agree with this. Here is his solution. Quote, "It can do this with middle-class tax hikes, cuts to middle-class entitlements, or a combination of both. Then the Fed can reduce the money supply and raise interest rates." End quote. Mr. Schiff, have you entirely lost your fucking mind? Have you completely detached yourself from reality? You are saying that a $3 trillion annual budget deficit should be paid by the 99% who make a average income of $66,000, but in reality their median income, keep hold of this figure, median income is less than 40,000. That means that 90% of the 99% makes $35,000 or less, which barely, barely stretches above minimum wage before tax. In a market where rent is on average greater than $1,000 a month, that's more than 70% of most people's income. Never mind groceries, which cost more than $300 a month because of this inflation. On top of their car insurance, which they need to keep running, you're adding another $1,000 a year, and groceries and insurance payments, which are at a minimum of $600 a year, on top of gas and electric, add another $200 a month. How the fuck do you expect us to pay for it? I am so enraged by the absolute ignorance, ambivalence, and borderline psychopathy of these three sentences that I cannot be quiet about it. So we're going to go on this fucking adventure together, you and me, the viewer, through my response to Peter Schiff and this toxic mentality of the 1%. Dear Peter Schiff, fuck you with a cactus and burn in hell with sincere loathing, the 99%. P.S. Rant to follow. You fucking entitled silver spoon sucking myopic cross-eyed cock smuggler. Your idea of economic restoration hinges on the idea of taxing everyone who sits between $35,000 and $55,000 median income per year. That is the middle class. Hold on to that figure. Slight correction for this. 2008 should be 2005. In 2005, your entire generation of Wall Street scumbag colleagues created a device for shorting a hyperinflated U.S. housing market that was, quote, too big to fail, unquote, and happily took premium installments on them while 18% of homeowners were being thrown out onto the streets. This device was created by Dr. Michael Burry that you may recognize from a movie called The Big Short, which was remarkably accurate to the events of what took place from 2005 till 2008. I highly recommend that everybody who has not seen the movie get well acquainted with it and watch it a few times, because even though it is essentially Hollywood drama, it does come quite close to the truth, quite scarily close to the truth. Continuing on. Your entire industry has barred the middle class from financial education for 60 fucking years because we're, quote, too stupid to be trusted with our own money. In the time between 2005 and 2007, while you and your buddies were snorting coke off of strippers' tits every weekend with money you took from people who signed mortgages that you knew nobody could fucking afford, you simultaneously buried billions of dollars in toxic securities. I want to make a slight amendation here. I'm not saying that Peter Schiff personally buried this money, and I'm not saying that he personally likes to snort coke off of strippers' tits. What I am saying is that the culture of Wall Street and all of the members of those investment firms were notorious for this activity, that this behavior was commonplace at the time, and that they were burying billions of dollars of toxic mortgage-backed securities into devices known as consolidated debt obligations that they knew were worthless and passed them on to the government in order to leave them holding the bag. through Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. Continuing on. These were concealed by the Standard & Poor and other ratings agencies that you strong-armed into giving AAA ratings on loans with a 15% likelihood of default or greater. When the bag got too heavy, your kind sold those securities to agencies that were willing to flip them for insurance. And y'all knew they weren't worth fucking toilet paper. You fucking knew it. You personally knew this because you called the crash. But you had the wisdom to warn people that the crash was coming because the lending standards were shit. And when the inevitable crash happened, we watched the banks and the investment firms responsible for the fucking mess all begin to fail simultaneously, including Lehman, the firm that kickstarted your career. And then we all watched the US government decide to bail out the bastards that were responsible for crashing the entire world economy with American taxpayer dollars, paid for primarily by the middle class. And now we're here for the third fucking time, watching the world's economy enter yet another recession of nuclear proportions. Why in the fuck are you advocating that the Fed raise rates and fuck the middle class in the ass again? Fuck you. This was your industry's fault. And you know it. You called it. You know who's responsible. You told everyone publicly that this system was going to fail because it was illogical and fraudulent. So why the fuck should the Fed cut our paychecks for a third time? It's your fucking turn. You and your fucking industry built itself as the financial leaders and the foundation of this entire planet's economy. And you repeatedly demonstrated that personal self-ingratiation is more important to you than the well-being of billions of people. Fuck you. Fuck you, fuck Jerome Powell, fuck the Fed, fuck the president, and fuck the whole corrupted system that decided that it's the middle class's responsibility to pay for your fuck-ups and your irresponsible financial decisions. It's your turn. I've absolutely had it with listening to these elitist financial suits ruling my life. The beauty of the internet is that knowledge and information is equally available to everyone. And if I can educate myself on Peter Schiff's life story in under 24 hours, then everyone can educate themselves on how the stock market crash and the 2008 subprime crisis was entirely Wall Street's fault and that it's going to happen again. I'm not going to pay for it. This is Wall Street's turn to pay their fucking dues. I am calling on everybody to spread this message, make it viral, that if this guy's sentiment prevails, then 30% of Americans will be homeless before 2030, and that any chance of justice for 2008 will be dead with the rest of the victims for that entire decade of financial fraud. Stop expecting the government to care or step in on the 99%'s behalf. They don't give a fuck about us. And if this guy, a man who called the 2008 crash 2 years early, can say, quote, make the middle class pay for it, then you know that the Senate is thinking the same fucking thing. Make sure everyone you know sees this asshole's message, because it's the exact message that Wall Street wants to make a reality. They turned off the buy button. They crashed the market. They made us pay for their fraud. Fuck them. Don't let it be forgotten. For the record, this is why I loathe Peter Schiff's answer to the budget problem. 600 people control nearly 50% of the US dollar in circulation, and the middle class should not pay one fucking dime. We will go through this together. For what it's worth, I recognize that Peter Schiff is not the same scum from Goldman Sachs and AIG that were popping champagne with our tax money in celebration for escaping the 2008 crash with zero consequences. But he knows more than anybody who was responsible. And he also knows that the middle class pays for every screw up made by the 1% every fucking time. And yet they own more money than anyone can spend in 5 generations. If you have not read Wealth Shown to Scale, then you don't understand what being in the 1% truly means. 600 people own this world, and they own it with apathy and ambivalence to the 99%. How many of us die as a result of their experiments and their chess games? Peter knows this deep down, but chooses to regurgitate the same response that was used in 2008 because it's best for his class. The class of elite wealth that is granted more tax breaks than are reasonable, sensible, or even sane, because they make the rules. And the rules say that they get to keep their money and we lose ours to pay for their fuck ups. So, yes, fuck you, Peter Schiff. Anyone sitting on millions or billions of dollars in managed assets that says that the middle class should pay for all this inflation is a fucking cruel, apathetic psychopath. And this is their fault. Make them pay for it. I would encourage you to stay with me as we go on a little bit further in this adventure. This is a GitHub page. It was written by Mark Horostoff to demonstrate wealth shown to scale. And if you have not seen this, then hang tight and please, please stay with me to the end. I understand it's long. Make time for this. Pause the video. Put it in your watch later list. Stop here. Don't continue until you have time to read it all because it's important. This is important. Take note of the scale. 1 pixel is $1,000. 10 by 10 pixels, $68,000. The U.S. median household income as of the time of writing, if I'm remembering correctly. This is as of 2018. 100 by 100 pixels is $1 million, and this is 1 billion. Now let's take a look at the wealth of Mr. Jeff Bezos. Please consider, as we go through this, that you're going to probably see some things that you'll find very upsetting to you. And you would be right too. There's something very wrong with the world that we live in. And the fact that I can go on this long at a casual pace as we scroll through looking at the casual wealth of billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars owned by just one person should scare you and make you very acutely aware of exactly who owns you and who controls the world that you live on. And if this does not hammer it home into your skull, then absolutely nothing will. Everybody needs to pay attention and really let this moment sink in. And this is only the beginning. There are no limits to the rage that this rises up within me. I want everybody to really truly think about what it means when somebody says that the 99%, the middle class, should pay for everything. Jeff is so wealthy that it is quite literally unimaginable. Yes. By the way, each of these large tick marks, if you didn't notice in the beginning, is just $80 million. That's right. Each of these large ticks, $80 million. $80 million is more than an entire family, an entire generation's wealth combined in America. In fact, most of us will never see $1 million earned in our entire lifetimes. Most people don't even get close. Most of us struggle to make our payments, to make ends meet. Some of us can barely even afford to heat our homes or feed our children. I say that as a person who is not a parent, but I am acutely aware of that struggle because I was once the child to one of those parents. We rarely see wealth inequality represented to scale, and this is part of the reason why Americans consistently underestimate the relative wealth of the super rich. Every 10 pixels you scroll is $5 million. I hope you'll excuse me while we just sit here and let this sink in for everybody. I've read this 5 times, I think, now, just to renew how deeply enraged I am by what this system has created. But we'll speed it up just for the sake of brevity. Okay, we're coming up on the end now. Well, just kidding. We're about a third of the way. Keep scrolling more, though there's more to see. Now you can actually see the ticker as the dollar signs continue to rise. That's right, all this time that we've just been sitting here, we barely even cracked through a third of Jeff Bezos' total net worth. And that was back in 2018 when this was created. It's bigger now. Let's put this wealth into perspective by comparing it to some familiar things. We'll speed it up a little more. I don't want to waste anyone's time. All the money you will ever earn in your life from the day you were born until the day you die is about $1.7 million. I think I said 1 million, so I apologize for that little discrepancy there. This is the annual cost of a healthcare for a family of 4. Annual pay of an Amazon warehouse worker as of 2018. Again, just have to remind you, all these figures are as of 2018. Let's try to keep that in perspective. Doesn't even consider the wealth crash. Oh, sorry, we don't want to miss this. This is the annual cost to house every homeless veteran in the United States. Let's just sit here for a few more seconds. Let's think about this. Because those of you that know me a little better might remember that I am a veteran. I wasn't homeless, but I did save my parents from homelessness with my fucking government GI Bill. That was supposed to be my money to go to college before the president in 2012 decided that, well, bailing out the banks and the car companies was a little bit more important than my tuition. So I didn't get to finish school in 2012. I had been going diligently to college from 2010 up until 2012. I was doing well. I was doing good in school. I was able to pay for all of my courses through tuition assistance while I was in the U.S. Army going to online college. And, well, suddenly I had to go on a garrison deployment station in Fort Knox, Kentucky. I had to drop out of my classes because I wasn't able to attend the in-person classes, and my college flunked me out of my courses because I wasn't entitled to an exemption. That's just my personal story. I don't even have a very difficult life. I don't have a personal struggle with hunger. I never was homeless. All I had to do is just sacrifice my entire all the cash that I had saved up to go to college in order to keep my parents from losing their home and putting them and my brother on the street. So, I feel some kind of way about just what a drop in the bucket this would be to Jeff Bezos. Just Jeff Bezos. Let's go on. Let's keep it quick. Annual cost of chemotherapy for all cancer patients is $9 billion. On July 20th, 2020, Jeff Bezos made $13 billion in a single day. Even the fortunes of very rich people are dwarfed by the incomprehensible wealth of the 0.0001%. That's the 1% of the 1% of the 1%. Sorry, a little slow on the draw. Drinking my coffee here. This is the wealth of Goldman Sachs CEO David Solomon. And I used to think that he was the biggest scumbag on the planet. Here's Beyonce. And here's Tim Cook, CEO of Apple. Lifetime earnings of a doctor, on average $6.7 million. Lawyers, $4 million. Hedge fund managers, $84 million. These people may see themselves as fabulously rich and often oppose policies aimed at reducing inequality. But many have not fully grasped the enormous gulf between themselves and the super rich. Just this single pixel, $200 million. To Mark Zuckerberg is 116 billion. Just under 2/3 of Jeff Bezos. So, we passed up Mark Zuckerberg only about 20 seconds ago. I won't make you go and sit through Mark Zuckerberg's scale either. I think we're beginning to understand. This adventure is kind of starting to sink in for you, I imagine. But the sad thing is that we're not even close to done. Look at the bottom left and you'll see where we are in our understanding of this lesson. We can have a world in which wealthy people exist without handing nearly all money to the super rich. And by the way, if you haven't gone already to go and look at all of these links, I'd really encourage you to do so. mkorostoff.github.io. Check it out. These links, they can tell you even more. No single human needs or deserves this much wealth. On this we should all agree, especially those that hold it. 400 richest Americans is $3.2 trillion. Jeff Bezos may be insanely rich, but it's a drop in the ocean compared to the combined wealth of his peers, the 400 richest Americans, who own more than $3.2 trillion, more than the bottom 60% of Americans. $400 people own all that. Are we beginning to understand just how separated we are? Do we truly understand the quote gulf between the fabulously wealthy and the supremely wealthy, the 400 richest Americans in the world? Because, see, the thing is that if we actually understood it, if we actually could etch this into our minds, every single one of us, even just Americans, not just the entire world, because a lot of foreigners, a lot of those in Europe and the Far East, they do understand just how separated it is. And we all have this notion that it's just impossible for all of us to do anything about it, that we're powerless to do something about this. But I think that what we have failed to realize is that we literally outnumber them 1,000,000 to 1. We really do. 1,000,000 to 1. Think about what might happen if 1% of the 99% just said, no, we're not going to deal with it. We refuse to pay for your mistakes. It's your turn. This is what Peter Schiff does not understand. He does not understand that the millions of human beings that we're scrolling past right now, each individually have a story. We all have our own tragedy. We all have our own feelings and thoughts, our history. And we matter. We matter just as much. There is something truly wrong with this world. There is something very wrong. Mr. Peter Schiff, you've built this economy. You've been a part of it. You have flourished amongst it. And you don't even approach the most wealthy people on this planet. Why are you advocating for the middle class? That's all this. That's all of this. All of these people's lives that, yes, combined, all together can pay for it. Yes, all combined. We could. But what sense does that make? Where's the logic and the fairness? How does that make any sense? I'm literally scrolling past this as fast as I can. Every single second, we are scrolling through more than 1 million people every second. What do you think we should do about it? When 400 people can pay just as much as 300 million. I think there's a little bit of an imbalance, don't you? The scales are not tilted perfectly. Let's agree on that before you make statements like that the middle class should revoke their entitlements and be taxed further. Because I'm going to tell you something. My 24% is not going to put a dent in this shit. You did this. You and your entire class did this. You created this imbalance. You created this unfair market. You have propped yourselves up with fraud. You've built yourselves up into positions of power with money that you stole from everyone here that we continue to scroll by. Do not tell me that the middle class needs to pay for all of this. Do not tell me that. That level of fucking ignorance is inexcusable. It's treasonous. Financial treason. That's what we're talking about here. We're talking about you being on the side of the supreme wealthy that decide who gets to keep their money. And doesn't the wealthy always get to keep their money? Are you not working in a company that's headquartered in Puerto Rico, which does not pay taxes to the US government? Isn't that right? What about your fair share, Mr. Schiff? How much do you pay in taxes? Not just personal. I won't even worry about the personal income. What about your company? What about your fund? How much does it pay in taxes every year? Care to disclose that? Tell me that you're paying your fair share, and I will retract my statement. But the thing is that I know how many assets you manage every year because that's the beauty of the internet, as I said before. I can look up anything about you that I want to know, and I can do it in minutes. I can find out anything I want about you, and I can verify and I can throw out the truths and the lies. I can tell the difference. Because, contrary to popular belief, the middle class is not so stupid. We are, in fact, smart enough to manage our own money. What's really happened is that you steal it from us. And I want it back. Everybody here wants it back. Fuck you. You have done nothing to contribute to this society other than to shuffle money from one account to the next. You move numbers from one bank to another. You buy these digital identities and assign them a value. And you think nothing of the humans that are beneath. We don't exist to you. But you should probably get very well acquainted with us very quickly. Because pretty soon, this 60%, this 300 million, will be coming to knock on your door, and we will be collecting. $1 trillion is such a large figure that you may as well say 11 gajillion zillion dollars. So in this section, we'll try to understand the scale of this figure by looking at what could be accomplished by various chunks of this wealth. Some will argue that using this wealth for a public benefit is not possible because it's, quote, tied up in stocks and therefore inaccessible. This is simply not true. I want to make this very clear. So we are going to go into this link. We are going to explore this. The paper billionaire argument. The most common argument against closing the wealth gap is that I've come to call the paper billionaire arguments. This is by Mr. Korostoff. The argument basically goes, quote, these people aren't really that wealthy because there's no way to liquidate this much wealth, end quote. It's an interesting and provocative argument worthy of serious discussion, but it is ultimately incorrect. Essentially, all of this wealth is held in stocks, bonds, and other comparable forms of corporate equity. The most common version of the paper billionaire argument I'm familiar with is that if all the rich people tried to sell all of this stock at once, the market would be flooded and the price would drop significantly. This statement may be technically true in absolute, but that's not how you liquidate securities. You would liquidate over several years in a carefully managed liquidation plan that avoids flooding the market, not in a giant lump sum. Billionaires regularly liquidate in this manner as a matter of routine, and it's never caused the market collapse, which consistently forecasted by billionaire defenders. I've never once heard of anyone advocate instant liquidation in an immediate one-time fire sale, except when used as a straw man to prove that the supposed impossibility of liquidation. Let's also explore this little tangent for a second. There was this event that happened in 2008 when Goldman Sachs decided that the toxic securities that they were holding in the form of mortgage-backed securities and toxic CDOs that they knew were worthless before anyone else did, and they finally kicked off the whole goddamn thing when they sold it all in a single afternoon. They got rid of all of their fucking MBS. They instantaneously liquidated it, and they kicked off the crash. They were the reasons why this took place. And they knew it was coming. But the market did end up recovering. The only problem is that it was the 99% that paid for that recovery, so that the banks could hold on to theirs. Now, you may be wondering just how slowly would you have to do this liquidation in order to avoid flooding the market? And the answer is surprisingly not that slowly. The market cap of the U.S. stock market is around $35 trillion, and around $122 trillion worth of stock changes hands in the U.S. every single year. If you wanted to liquidate $1 trillion over, say, 5 years, that would constitute about 0.16% of all the trading that happens in that time. There are a wide variety of serious policy proposals floating around aimed at reducing inequality, and none of them include a massive immediate seizing of all assets from wealthy people. Some play out over generations, such as a more progressive inheritance and gift tax. Some play out over decades, such as more progressive capital gains and corporate tax structure. The others play out over a few years, such as immediate term deficit spending repaid over time through a single-digit wealth tax. Another version of the paper billionaire argument holds that you couldn't sell all of these stocks over a period of time because only other billionaires would be able to buy them, and that's simply nonsense. Market participation may not be 100%, but it's a hell of a lot more than 400 people. Half of all households in the U.S. own stock, either directly or through 401k and IRA investment plans. On a given day, millions of individuals buy stock mostly through their retirement accounts, a few $100s at a time. But let's set all of this aside and suppose that the paper billionaire argument is actually true. It's not, but for the sake of argument. Let's suppose liquidating this wealth caused 80% of it to vanish into thin air. That would leave behind $700 billion, still enough to eradicate malaria, provide everyone on Earth with water and waste disposal, and lift every American out of poverty, and test every single American for coronavirus. I think this is one of the points that should come through most clearly in this website. The amounts we're dealing with are so mind-flayingly large that it scarcely matters if our calculations are off by 500%. I find it telling that no one ever tries to quantify the paper billionaire argument. They never ask, how big is the total market? Or what proportion could we safely liquidate without some major negative consequences? No, they simply look at the massive scale of global wealth and the massive scale of global poverty, and then they retreat into cynicism. The millions dead from preventable diseases, unsolvable, they declare. Those who would address global poverty just, quote, don't understand how stocks work, end quote. Perhaps it's easier to just declare the problem unsolvable than to confront the massive human cost of your ideology, but confront it we must. The money is there. We just need to take it. As we proceed, try to keep in mind all this wealth is controlled as a group so small that they could fit on a single 747 airplane with 260 seats left over. This is the wealth equal to 200 million Americans, just the back half of the plane. What could we do with just under 10% of this money? We could vaccinate every human on Earth against coronavirus. Based on the cost of vaccines and the cost of delivery, it would take around $200 billion to vaccinate every person on Earth, which is about 6% of the wealth currently controlled by 400 Americans. After paying for this vaccination program, these individuals would still be $4 billion richer than they were before the pandemic. Even setting aside the desperate humanitarian need for global vaccination, there is still a strong self-interest argument that wealthy countries should do it. The longer COVID circulates in the world, the more chance of a vaccine-resistant variant emerging and undoing all the vaccine progress we've already made. The World Health Organization is currently organizing a global vaccine donation program which aims to vaccinate about 20% of residents in poor countries by the end of 2021, and even that approach has substantial funding shortfalls. Permanently eradicate malaria, 3% of all of their wealth. Malaria is one of the worst infectious diseases ever visited on mankind, probably killing more people than any other infectious disease in history. In the 20th century alone, malaria killed more people than the Black Death, which killed 2/3 of the European population back in the, 1200s? Annual malaria deaths, 409,000. Ebola deaths in all of human history were about 15,000, but we got a vaccine for that pretty quickly, didn't we? These figures are even more shocking when you learn that malaria overwhelmingly kills children. Around 2/3 of malaria deaths each year are children under 5. That's around 275,000 children. I have to show you this. I have to make it clear. I have to make everybody understand. I'm not being polite. I'm not being quiet. And I'm not being soft. I will be blunt. And I will be violent. And I will be angry. And I will be vengeful. With every ounce of energy that I have. This is wrong. There is no shortage of problems solvable by the tremendous gap in wealth being equalized. There is no excuse for anyone to hold on to this much money. It does not benefit mankind. The insistence of the elite and the wealthy on holding on to every dollar that they gain to selfishly squirrel it away and pack it into funds, put it overseas, evade taxes, and manipulate the markets to their benefit is wrong. because their selfishness, their greed, their irresponsibility kills millions of people every year. It is a direct result. It is not indirect anymore. Their decisions kill people. Peter Schiff, I want to remind you that what you are proposing is that it is far better for people who are struggling with hunger, rent, heat, food, and health care to pay for the entire sum of the U.S. inflation crisis, when all it would take is for 6% of the 400 wealthiest individuals' wealth, and they would still have made billions in profit since the coronavirus began. Have you lost your fucking mind? You piece of shit. You do not even fathom the lives that are destroyed by these types of decisions. I can't take watching any more of this. We're going to continue. All of these deaths are preventable. Treating and preventing malaria is a well understood science, universally practiced in the developed world. It's estimated that malaria could be globally eradicated by 2030 for a cost of around $1.84 per at risk person per year, or around $100 billion total. This would be around 3% of the wealth currently possessed by the 400 richest Americans. Around 800 children will die of malaria today. A small group of super rich people could stop it for a sum of money so small that they would likely never even notice its absence, but they choose not to. .5% of their wealth could wipe out all of the delinquent medical debt in America. Americans have around $81 billion in medical debt that is sufficiently past due as to appear on their credit report. These are generally small debts with a median value of around $207 per person. These debts hinder the credit of over 50 million Americans and do long-term damage to their housing, employment, and borrowing options. The cost of repaying this debt dollar for dollar would be around 2.5% of the wealth controlled by the 400 richest Americans. The situation looks even better once you understand that delinquent debt is often purchased for as little as 1% of its face value. This would make the total cost of eliminating all delinquent debt around $810 million. In 2020, the richest 400 Americans accrued this amount roughly every 29 hours. 7-day wealth increase of the 400 richest Americans in 2020, $4.6 billion. Cost of universal buyback of delinquent medical debt, $810 million. Please understand, this is how much wealth that the 400 richest Americans accumulated in just 7 days. This is the cost to pay for everyone's medical expenses. Everyone. Note that this figure includes only delinquent medical debt, not all medical debt. The value of all medical debt in America is not publicly known, but probably in the neighborhood of $300 billion, or 9% of the wealth controlled by 400 Americans. It would cost 5.3% to lift every American out of poverty. As of 2021, around 38 million Americans lived in poverty. If Americans in poverty were a state, they would be the second largest by population. There are more Americans living in poverty than the entire population of Canada. The population of U.S. states compared to poverty in 2021: California, the impoverished, and Texas. Every single person in America could be lifted above the poverty line with a one-time cash subsidy of around $10,000 per impoverished family and about $7,000 for impoverished individuals. The cost would be $170 billion, a little over 5% of the wealth controlled by 400 individuals. It may seem counterintuitive that a one-time subsidy could have any lasting impact on chronic poverty, but one of the surprising truths about poverty is that it's fluid. Americans move in and out of poverty many times throughout their lives, and one good year can have a massive, long-lasting effect. A wealth of data now supports the idea that a one-time cash transfer can permanently transform a local economy. Given a sudden windfall, people invest in their future. They go back to school, obtain transportation, pay for childcare, pay down debilitating debts, and do any number of things to improve their career prospects and financial future. Let's explore this theory. Research on cash transfers. Many people, including us, grew up hearing that you can't just give money to poor people, but as it turns out, this view was largely based on anecdote and hearsay. The first rigorous experiments testing this approach, and many others, did not begin until the 1990s. Since then, we've learned an enormous amount about the impacts that cash transfers have had on the lives of people living in poverty, with over 300 studies from around the world. Summarizing the results of these studies is a difficult task, in part because the whole point of cash transfers is to give different people the freedom to do different things, so there's no one answer to the impacts of cash. Also, cash transfers can come in different amounts, at different frequencies, and with varying levels of hoops to jump through to receive them. We do our best below to draw out the main lessons as we understand them, citing independent external reviews of multiple studies whenever possible, and framing individual studies as examples when not. We are also actively engaged in producing new evidence through a series of more than a dozen experimental studies which you can read about. Independent reviewers agree that cash is an effective way to help people living in poverty. Governments, nonprofits, and researchers have tested variants of just giving money all over the world. Evidence was extracted from 165 studies covering 56 cash transfer programs in low and middle income countries. There is strong evidence that cash transfers are associated with reductions in monetary poverty. GiveWell. Cash transfers have the strongest track record that we've seen for a non-health intervention and are a priority program of ours. Campbell Corporation. Cash transfers are the most cost-effective, are more cost-effective, excuse me. Cash transfers are more cost-effective than vouchers, which are more cost-effective than any kind of food assistance. Cash transfers are one of the more thoroughly researched forms of development intervention. Yet people living in extreme poverty rarely get to decide how aid money intended to help them gets spent. Cash transfers put aid budgets directly in the hands of people we aim to help, make up a very small proportion of aid and charitable giving. I'll leave this as an exercise for the reader to go out and find out more about on their own, because if you're at this point, then I assume that I have your attention long enough that you're going to go and look further. In the U.S., for all of the people that escape poverty in any given year, about half stay out of poverty for at least 5 years afterwards. About a third are still out of poverty 10 years later. I'd like to call attention to the ticker at the bottom left, which we have only just now reached 78 billion. We haven't even reached the first third of our scale. This would not be a permanent fix for all Americans. Surely some would quickly return to poverty, and others face debt so large that the subsidy would make very little difference. But for tens of millions of Americans, this would be a life-changing event. It would be a generation-defining social program that reshapes our economy for decades to come. 7.5% of the 400 richest Americans' wealth could provide clean drinking water and toilet access to every human on Earth. Around 844 million people have no access to clean water of any kind, and about the same number have no access to a toilet or a latrine, and therefore defecate in the open. This is the percentage of the globe which is affected by no clean water. Contaminated water is a major source of disease, including cholera, dysentery, and typhoid. It's estimated that contaminated water kills around 829,000 people every year, making it one of the world's biggest killers. The cost to provide clean water and waste disposal for everyone on Earth would be around 240 billion, or 7.5% of the wealth controlled by the 400 richest Americans. Now that we've established the scale of inequality in the United States, let's dare to dream a little bigger. What could we do with under 40% of all this money? Provide paid maternity and paternity leave to every American for the next 100 years. Paid maternity and paternity leave are estimated to cost around $12 billion per year. This is 0.39% of the wealth controlled by 400 Americans. It is 5% of the wealth they accrued in 2020 alone. If they repeated this payment every year for the next 100 years, it would equal 39% of the wealth they control just today. This is a more complex program to estimate than the others considered on this page because the expense would be continuous rather than one time, and the cost is highly variable based on the size of the benefit provided. Still, using the 5% endowment payout rule, the super wealthy should be able to finance a family leave program about 12 times more generous than the one contemplated here forever and still get richer into perpetuity, even accounting for inflation. 40% could give $10,000 to every American household. There are about 128 million households in the United States. To give each one $10,000 would cost $1.28 trillion, or about 40% of the wealth controlled by 400 Americans. As the coronavirus raged through America in 2020, working people were frequently presented with a seemingly impossible choice between death by premature reopening and an economic depression brought about through a confused quarantine. Unspoken in this false choice was the supposition that Americans could not pay their living expenses without either work or unsustainable government deficit spending. Where else could the money have possibly come from? What could we do with 60% of this money? Vaccinate the world against COVID, eradicate malaria, wipe out delinquent medical debt, paid family leave annually, provide clean water and toilet access to all humans on Earth, give $10,000 to every American household, and there would still be $1.3 trillion remaining. These programs combined would completely transform our world. By redistributing this wealth, millions of lives would be saved. Billions would be rescued from poverty and disease. By inconveniencing just 400 people, the entire human race could advance to a new, unprecedented level of development. And all of them would still be billionaires afterwards. Is it really so radical to suggest that this is the right thing to do? Given the choice between millions of deaths and slightly shrinking the fortunes of a few super rich people, how could anyone conclude that the death of millions is preferable? We cannot accept this level of inequality any longer. And now we allow the scale to continue. This is the reason why Peter Schiff's tweet enraged me so greatly. For those of you that know me, you should really know that I mean what I say. Peter Schiff is an arrogant, psychopathic, ignorant asshole to think that the 99% should pay what 400 of the richest Americans in the world would be able to just drop out of their pockets. You can go fuck yourself. You pay for it. This is your fault. Not you personally, but your class, your industry, your buddies, your governments, your corporations. Everyone that built this inequality is to blame because you were more concerned with the rapid accruance of such incomprehensible wealth that you literally starved the consumer, your customers, out of every dollar that they had to pay for it. You've quite literally starved yourselves dry. You've made it impossible for the system to continue. And the reason is because nobody has any money left. You've already taken it all. You have taxed us to poverty. The fact that the median income now is only barely hanging above minimum wage should be a very telling sign. And the fact that minimum wage doesn't pay for 1 month's expenses. It takes 3 times that to pay for even basic housing. That means every person is forced to work 3 jobs minimum wage in order to just find a place to live. That does not include groceries. That does not include electricity, internet access, gas, heat, or healthcare. Why the fuck should we pay anything after what you've done to us? What kind of sense does that make? Mr. Peter Schiff, are you out of your fucking mind? I will ask you again. I will ask everybody again. Are you out of your fucking mind? Look at the gap. Look at what is happening. Look at what you have done. Look at what you have stolen from us. Look at the damage you've caused. Look at the burning, bleeding, dying planet that you live on. If your plan is to get on the first spaceship into orbit, guess what? It's going to be the rest of us down here that have to supply you. I don't think you've thought about that. There is no escape. You are stuck here with the rest of us. There is no way out from this problem other than to put an end to this nonsense forever. The idea that 400 million people can accrue more than 50% of the entire US dollar in circulation is completely insensible and insane. Anyone who agrees with this mode in which we operate is a complete moron. And if you continue on down this path, then I guarantee that the money will not matter. It won't matter. Because you need to pay workers to hoe fields and to sow crops. You need to pay someone to mine the ore out of the ground, and you need to pay people to pull oil out of the earth. You need to pay someone to run your electrohydrostatic dams. You need to pay someone to give you everything that you use to subsist on daily. Your food that comes to your dinner table is cooked by someone that must prepare it, and they must buy it, the ingredients, from someone who must collect it, store it, and house it, and care for it. And that must be paid for by someone who is willing to grow it and sell it. You've made it impossible for people to do all of those things and continue to live. You are wondering why there's a labor shortage? Because what's the fucking point? Why the fuck should we work anymore? We're all going to die because you have taken all of the wealth and you've made it impossible for us to work hard enough to live. We can't work hard enough to live. There's not enough hours in the day to collect enough pay. It's not possible anymore. Anyone that's living on a wage of less than $60,000 is approaching the poverty line. And many flop back and forth on each side of the line on a regular basis because we're taxed to oblivion. Our healthcare is completely insensible. We can't pay to go see a doctor. Some of us can't even pay to keep the lights on. Now, I'm speaking of this as a person with a tremendously privileged position. I understand that. I myself am middle class. I make a 6-figure income. I do pretty well for myself because I happened to land into a tech job that did treat me well. That is a fact. I will readily admit that. But I used to be a person who had to turn pipe wrenches. I used to be a person who had to work 3 jobs. I used to be a soldier. And all I got in return for that was I had to bust my ass every single day just so that I could afford a fast food chain burger once a day, to save my parents from homelessness, and to keep my brother in his bedroom. To be able to go and see a doctor once a year. To be able to afford a used car that barely ran. And to be able to go to school so that I might be able to crawl out of that someday. Up until the US government decided that I wasn't worth that. That my benefits were a little bit too gracious, so they took them away and decided that the soldiers' paycheck was just enough by itself. My $300 per month while I was in the reserve. What a joke. Sure, I got housing and meals as a soldier, but the paycheck was a joke. I didn't get any tuition benefits. That all got taken away. And by the time the taxes were done with it, there was only a few $100s left after my reserve drills. Veterans might get a few $1,000s. The active duty might get a few $1,000s, maybe a little more, if they get hazard pay for being in combat. And the only reason that they're in combat is because you decided that they needed to go overseas just to go and defend a fucking oil field, or a refinery, or a mining operation, or a source of raw ore. It's only because people on top decided that the government wasn't doing enough to defend their interests. Their $3.2 trillion in personal interests. The fact that the entire US debt could be covered overnight just by liquidating a portion of what the 400 richest Americans have accrued, and we haven't done that yet, really speaks volumes to how fucking nearsighted and stupid our system is. I can't stand to be quiet about it anymore, and neither should anyone else. And now we've come to the end. Thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If there is anything that you should take away from this, is that you should be angry. You should be very angry at the notion that the middle class should pay anything after what's been done. This video is not going to be monetized in any way. I want everybody to see this. I want everybody to share this message with their friends and understand, and to help everyone understand, that this system does not fix itself unless we make it so. My call to action for you is to go over this yourself, visit this website, click the links, and follow every article to truly get a grasp of just how deep the rabbit hole goes and just how tall the mountain is in dollars and bodies stacked on top of each other for these 400 individuals to stand on the peak of. I really, really want you to understand that. That you and I, our families, and everyone we know and love do not matter in the scope of this tremendous, mind-boggling inequality of wealth to them. Our lives are that of ants. And I will quote a message from Bug's Life, a movie from our childhood that should deliver a message that is most appropriate. Those ants outnumber us 100 to 1. And if they ever figure that out, then there goes our way of life.